The first thing one notices about the civilization of Llhuros is that it is an extraordinary mashup of three rather different fields that involve world building: archaeology, art, and fiction. It is a creative enterprise, a thing made, but it is also introduced to us as a set of ruins. Its abraded paintings and murals, damaged votive objects, sculptural and architectural fragments, bits of poetry and music form the surviving remnants of a long-gone civilization. And it is a set of ruins in two other senses as well. It is the major part of what survives of Norman Daly's artwork, and like all man-made things, it has been decaying since the moment it was created, inching along the path that leads ultimately to full ruination. So it is worth asking, what kinds of ruins are these, and how do they relate to the long history of Western fascination with ruins as a source of aesthetic pleasure and cultural value? As a project in mock archaeology, the civilization of Llhuros resonates with what I postulate as the four major eras of meaning-making around ruins, and I find it especially pertinent to present-day concerns. The first phase of Western thinking about ruins dates back more than 2 millennia to ancient Greece. In this phase, the most salient form that ruins took was the architectural remnants of vanished civilizations, bearing the marks of the cultural and physical violence that brought them down. The focus is on the Mediterranean world, where several millennia of intercultural conquest and rebuilding had left the landscape littered with many layered ruins. The general vibe here is nostalgia for lost golden ages and an appreciation for ruins as metaphors for mortality and the instability of memory. This take on ruins appears quite early. By the 2nd century BCE, Greek poets were already lamenting over ruins in various of their cities. But in Western culture, this phase reached a peak during the period that spans from the Renaissance, with its admiration for the lost glories of Greece and Rome, to the 18th century's grand tours exposing well-to-do young European men to classical ruins as a social rite of passage. By the time of the Renaissance, the lamentations have given way to a mood of satisfaction. Renaissance thinkers admired classical ruins for their formal excellence, and by claiming cultural descent from classical civilizations, they postulated a transfer of that greatness across time, often within a Christianizing and later a colonialist context. As time passed, however, the congratulatory mood became tinged with the type of melancholy that centers on decayed and vanished objects. Ruins worship thus shifted into ruins contemplation. But at the same time, there remain several kinds of pleasure to be found in these ruins. There is first of all an enduring aesthetic schadenfreude, what one might summarize as rather them than us, that led the novelist Henry James to call his own persistent quest for ruins a heartless pastime. There is also a pleasure in the renewals of nature at the expense of human culture. Because classical ruins decayed slowly over millennia after the first phase of more abrupt destruction, they became entangled with plant life. Ivy twining over walls, trees growing inside roofless buildings. By becoming nature, they became more acceptably pleasurable to contemplate. And this was also true of how later ruins were often understood and depicted in art. Likewise, the first and most straightforward way to understand the ruins of the civilization of Llhuros is through this classical style admiration for lost grandeur. The expansiveness of Daly's imagination, especially across multiple media, invites us to imagine an equally extensive civilization now lost, as well as reminding us that with the loss of Daly himself, his civilization has become even more irrecoverable than any real civilization from ages past. Created as fragments, with his death all excavations ceased, what we now have in the way of Llhurosian artifacts is all that we will ever have. A foreclosing somewhat different from that of real-world archaeology, which is continually fueled by the hopes of the next big discovery. In particular, Daly's focus on the remnants of culture, religious statues, paintings, architecture, poems, over such banal items as cooking pots and shoes, suggests that something imaginatively unique in the way of a civilization has been lost, even though it never existed. And the high craft skills he brought to his painting, woodworking, stone carving, and metalworking demands our frank admiration. The second phase in Western appreciation of ruins is the era of artificial ruins created by wealthy European landowners as landscape decorations. Sometimes termed follies, these structures were erected in an already ruined state, sometimes with an associated fable supposedly accounting for their existence, a kind of imaginative knowledge. Popular artificial ruins ranged from destroyed castles and towers to classical style temples, hermitages, grottos, and monuments. The first of these deliberately fake ruins date back to the 16th century, but the heyday of this form of landscape design was the later 18th and 19th centuries. Over this period, taste shifted from ruins referencing classical antiquity to a more parochial type centered on the ancient history of the British Isles, paralleling the development of Anglo-centric antiquarianism. At this point, a generalized appreciation of ruins morphs into creative interventionism. No longer are the actual leftover ruins enough. Now we must have ruins carefully sited and designed for maximum viewer appreciation. Reality is judged substandard and on aesthetic grounds inferior. Plus, there simply aren't enough of the real ruins to go around. What the eye can see takes precedence now over what the mind knows about these ruins. And indeed, some of these artificial ruins weren't even especially well made. Like theatrical sets, they were constructed out of paint on canvas or plasterwork treated to resemble stone, masterpieces of deceit only at a distance. These faux ruins, with their faux histories, attempted to combine the inquisitive joys of archaeology and antiquarianism with that pleasure we take in the various craft expertise necessary to convincingly fake a set of ruins. How successful viewers found this illusion varied greatly. Some contemporary writers saw artificial ruins as providing a stimulus comparable to that of real ruins, while others mocked them as whimsical and fraudulent. And certainly they were never far from that farm of comedy springing from excess of any kind. When Sir Edward Turner's faux ruin fell down, for example, and he wrote to a friend to come and deplore the ruin of my ruin, the response is as likely to be a chuckle as sympathy. Unquestionably, the civilization of Llhuros is a great-grandchild of these artificial ruins. No more than any of the 18th and 19th century garden follies do the Llhurosian artifacts stem from an actual ancient civilization. They are carefully fabricated to deceive the casual viewer, but like those older ruins, Llhurosian objects reflect their own era at least as much as the ancientness they attempt to channel. Artificial ruins demonstrate, perhaps even better than real ones, the way that all ruins, as they continue to change over time, sometimes suffering further destruction, sometimes being partially restored or repurposed, all eventually become a collage of time. When creating garden follies, it was quite common for landowners to incorporate bits of real ruins into their newly constructed instant ruins, layering the past and the present together according to specific ideas of how the past should look. Similarly, many Llhurosian artifacts incorporate fragments of contemporary metal objects, mostly tools and kitchenware. Essentially anything of the right scale and with a sufficiently abstract look that it cannot immediately be placed as belonging to the 20th century. Llhurosian ruins also bear kinship with two more purely conceptual kinds of artificial ruin. The first is the fantasies of future ruination, produced by artists in the later 18th century, partially in response to the fad for follies. Notable among these efforts are the visionary architect Joseph Gandy's several paintings of the ruination of the Bank of England, and Hubert Robert's painting of a destroyed Louvre museum. As with Daly, these artists are asking their audiences to assume that they are looking backward from the future to a past that stems from an alternative history, a form of visual speculative fiction. It is striking, too, that these two painters, Gandhi and Robert, also focus specifically on the ruination of art and architecture as stand-ins for everything else that matters about the entire civilization that is now presumed lost. The second type of artificial ruin embraces those elements that are not physically made so much as projected onto a landscape in the form of stories told about existing things that are not well understood. For example, in 19th century America, it was common for a certain kind of thinker to look at the large American burial mounds, the petroglyphs, and other ancient traces on the landscape and conjure from them faux histories in which America had been settled by the lost tribes of Israel, or the Atlanteans, or some long vanished race of giants. Here, the ruins are quite real, but the stories artificialize them, creating a temporary conceptual facade between the viewer and the object. So one way of thinking about the Llhurosian ruins is similarly as a set of quite real 20th century art objects, mostly paintings and small sculptures, that have had an artificial history interposed between viewer and object. Indeed, one line of thought following the philosopher Arthur Danto holds that all modern art is the subject of a story that must be told to the viewer for full understanding, for example, in the form of a didactic or a critical interpretation. Llhuros only departs from this requirement in telling a particularly unusual kind of story about the created objects. If, as Andreas Schönle remarked, we cannot leave ruins alone, we need to make them speak, then Llhuros is speaking in a double voice, as artificial ruins and as contemporary art. The third phase in the Western relationship to ruins appears in the wake of capitalism and became a hallmark of the 20th century. Early in the century, Walter Benjamin remarked on how modernity requires an endless cycle of ruination. With its commitment to planned obsolescence and the selling of novelty, capitalism is essentially a machine for producing ruins. In effect, it creates what one might call obligatory ruins, things produced specifically to turn into ruins fairly quickly, so that new, though not necessarily better, things can be produced and sold in their place. At the same time, the escalating brutality, scale, and speed of destruction in the last century has greatly diminished, indeed, almost obviated, whatever pleasure was formerly to be had in contemplating the slow ruins of the ancient world. This explains the rise of the term ruin porn, a form of schadenfreude that has displaced ruins worship and ruins contemplation as the dominant mindset. Notably, ruin porn seems always to refer to recent ruins, to the neglect and destruction of recent eras. You seldom see photographs of the Parthenon or Petra tagged as ruin porn. Henry James's heartless private pastime has been commodified for the society of the spectacle, a form of cultural shame attempting recuperation via aesthetics. A futile move, the attempt to take some form of joy in that which at a deeper level is haunted by desperation and despair. Capitalism has also brought us an expansion in the types of ruins. In addition to the architecture and statuary surviving from the ancient world, we are now all too familiar with industrial ruins and drowned or abandoned towns and habitations. And that does not even include those smaller ruins that we call consumer products, because the term ruins is ordinarily limited to architecture. Though I suggest that we may want to rethink this because of the sheer pervasiveness of ruination as an activity of late capitalism. Our most iconic contemporary ruin may thus be the global patchwork of open, giant landfills and waste dumps, not to mention the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. No longer an afterthought of war, a process left to time in the physics of wind and rain, capitalist ruination begins before something is even built. It is part of the initial conceptualization. Even some buildings, those most solid of objects, are now deliberately built to last only for the short term. Some authors have referred to these as ruins in reverse, or fast ruins. The overvaluation of novelty creates a different mood when we contemplate recent ruins, like the industrial commercial ruins of the upper Midwest, for example, the boarded up factories, warehouses, train stations, hotels, and power plants. No longer are we reflecting on a lost golden age, but rather mourning the foreclosure of promised utopian futures that never came to pass. At the same time, the fact that such ruins have been placed outside of the ordinary functions of a capitalist economy turns them into spaces with the potential to be reclaimed for vernacular uses. Indeed, an entire new vocabulary has emerged that highlights this potent indeterminacy of contemporary ruins. Parafunctional spaces, indeterminate spaces, urban interstices, edgelands, and, my favorite, drost-scapes. In the Civilization of Llhuros, we find a response to these obligatory ruins, these objects created with an eye to their future ruination. Like his younger contemporary Jean Tinguely, Norman Daly makes a deliberate effort to salvage items from the waste stream of industrial capitalism. Bound into the artifacts of ancient Llhuros are bits of all sorts of commercial products that would otherwise have ended up as landfill. Llhuros itself thus becomes a parafunctional space, a repurposing within art that also provides each rescued object with an entirely new backstory. Quite often, these metamorphoses have a slightly tongue-in-cheek quality reminiscent of the comedic undertones of those earlier artificial ruins. And by affiliating itself with ancient history, the Civilization of Llhuros dodges the shame-inducing voyeurism of ruin porn, opting instead for the more hopeful ethos of reuse. It has been noted that ruins collapse binaries between past and present, useful and useless, transient and persistent, to name just a few of the more evident ones. There is a sense in which all ruins are postmodern, embodying what the architect Robert Venturi, in quite another context, termed the messy vitality that foregrounds an ethos of inclusion rather than exclusion. Even as ruins are always shedding bits of themselves, they are also porous and accretive, accommodating plant growth, as we have seen, squatters, and the ad hoc infill of repurposing. If the last century was the era of obligatory ruins, this 21st century may be the era of universal ruins. Climate change and economic inequality have pushed us into a state of mind where we are collectively consumed with the idea of ruins as omnipresent and unstoppable. It seems as if we can now only foresee ever more destruction on an ever larger scale, demonstrated for us by the ruins now accumulating around us faster than politics and economics and sheer human resistance seem able to outpace them. Ruins have always, to a certain extent, gestured to a foreclosed future while being primarily occupied with the past, and now it appears that the balance of attention has reversed. Today's ruins are understood at least as much in the context of a disappearing future as of a disappeared past. In this context, I find myself lingering over Gustave Doré's 1872 etching showing a future tourist gazing over the ruins of London. It is a good deal bleaker than the earlier paintings that we saw of future ruins, implying that in the end there is no safe spot from which to enjoy the ruins of one's own time. Artists have responded to this emergence of universal ruins and ruination in any number of ways, including the current outpouring of work focused on climate change. I see Norman Daly's Llhuros project as a harbinger of this era in the way it presumes an art that is necessarily ruins, in the way that it immerses its viewers in the idea of ruination as a possible mode of being, not an historical accident. In this context, it's worth noting how he borrowed the antiquarian form of the archaeological catalog for his 1972 Llhuros exhibition at Cornell University, a form that explicitly foregrounds its contents as remnants rather than as pristine artworks. And I take other mock archaeological and anthropological projects like those of Beauvais Lyons, Richard Purdy, Thomas Doyle, Iris Heusler, and many others as likewise addressing the centrality of ruination in this era. Ruins generally remain on the periphery of cultural consciousness, a bunch of leftover things that just don't seem on the face of it to have much connection to the urgent preoccupations of the day. And yet, if we look back over the four phases I have described of nostalgic ruins, artificial ruins, obligatory ruins, and universal ruins, we see a very large temporal shift. No longer are we looking at ruins through the wrong end of a telescope, as in the era of nostalgic ruins, seeing something far away and minute. Instead, we see ourselves drowning in an ocean of universal ruins with a magnified sense of impending doom. It may seem that something as fantastical as Norman Daly's Civilization of Llhuros, an outlier in the art world of its own day, stands as an improbable marker of this sea change. But I hope I have shown how it embodies the many different aspects of our centuries-long relationship to ruins. One might observe that compared to most contemporary ruins, Daly's Llhurosian ruins have the advantage that they came into being inside the art world, where they are somewhat protected by a long-standing ethos of preservation and care. In effect, they are slow ruins. And as such, they have given us a chance to reflect on how to come to terms with the other forms of ruination we now face. Thank you very much.